Let it down. Yeah. Well, that's why we're recording it. Yeah, Screwtape Letters is fun. Or Mere Christianity. You ever read that? That's a good one. Well, welcome. Let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your church. And as we explore ideas around it, we ask that you would open our eyes, soften our spirits, stimulate our minds in ways that we might glorify and honor you. Pray these things in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. I know, again, I said this last week, I'll say this week, I know this has been somewhat of a drudgery, going through some of this, and what I hope that you, and that's okay, but what I hope you find occasionally in this is every now and then a paragraph or a couple sentences that grab you. Because there's a lot in here, and honestly, we were talking earlier, just the fact that so much of what's in here is like this original version, which I wish I would have bought the new version and then compared the two, and then I don't know what I would have done. We wouldn't have been able to buy them in bulk, but maybe I would. But this is a much better version. It just slims it down, and there's a lot of stuff going on in this. But what we're going to do today is I'm just going to give you a 2-minute summary of the last sort of the whole thing of the last 2 weeks, and then we'll dive into this and just remind ourselves of where he's going. And I'll say this: if you have a question, like if you wrote the question mark on your book on the margin, when we're on that page, ask. Like that's. Pat and I were talking, and I said I forgot when I used to, because I am always with you, I don't think about it. But when I used to speak to folks, I used to say, look, if there's something that comes up, please interrupt me. I am not I like rabbit trails. I think that's where teaching moments are. I think that's where we learn and grow, because we can stop and discuss. And I know that otherwise I have a tendency and will be talking, and I don't want to just do that, because it actually goes against much of what Wilson is talking about. But again, to the general book, the original one was called Lessons for the Church by McIntyre, from McIntyre's After Virtue. And again, I think this just sort of slants towards that new monasticism. And I think so much of the introduction really just is saying, these are the critiques since the last time the book was published. I want to address some of these and sort of lay out the framework. But really with the heart of what he's talking about, started last week in the chapter that we looked at about, I don't know what it's called. What was the name of the subtitle of it? Or the Living with Our History. And that's really an argument to say everything is historically bound. When push comes to shove, you want to put that whole chapter, everything is historically bound. You can't look at, and not only that, but everything that we are has a history. And to understand that, you need to really sort of figure out where in history your beliefs were formed or solidified. And sometimes, and like I said, through the different traditions of the church, you can go, but if you want to see you want to know what worship looked like in the 5th or 6th century, go to an Eastern Orthodox church. It hasn't changed much. Same with the Roman Catholic Church. You want to see what worship looked like in a church, and well, I guess Vatican II did alter some things. But in Rome, you can still get some Latin services. But if you go to the much of the theology and the liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church was developed and solidified in that period from 1000 to 1500, and then carried on after Second Vatican Council. It was changed in this last century, but before that, it was pretty stable. And if you want to look at Presbyterian worship, why we do it, the movements of our worship, we have these four, the rationale for it all goes back to the 16th century. And so that sense of who we are is stuck in history. And all he's saying is we really need to know our history. We're really going to look at this and figure this out. Now, chapter 2 starts in this second phase where he's like, let's talk about this and what it means to live in a fragmented world. And if I could give you the whole thing like that in just sort of a nutshell, I would basically say that he's making the argument that who we are living out in our Western United States sort of expression is a fragment of bygone eras. And the best way, and that I would like to sort of just frame that idea for you is sometimes, and he talks a little bit about form in here and content, and how sometimes things are established in history and they have a history to them and people attach themselves to them, but as they move forward in history, they no longer make sense. But the history and the tradition still claims those things. And the argument that he's going to make is not that we should just embrace whatever we feel like, which is what that Nietzschean argument he talked about, that was just sort of as an expression of ourselves, but that we should look back in history and trace back to where these things were first expressed and understand the context that they were expressed in. So if you're going to understand the proclamation of the gospel, you go back to the first and second century. If you're going to, so on and so forth. So if you want to understand institutionalized Christianity, the church as it is, you go back to the time of Constantine when everything became a state religion. You want to know why separation of church and state was such a big deal in the US? Because they were, when they came over and established that, they were in the throes of having too much intertanglement between having a state religion. It wasn't about the church not interfering with, it wasn't about the state not interfering with the church, which is what we as sometimes in Christianity, we're like, oh, the state's trying to invade our privacies and our rights as churches. Well, sometimes that's true, but really the establishment of, we think that the establishment of our nation was so that we, and it was to some extent to have choice in religion, but it was also to prevent a government that was guided by the church.
Church of England.
Well, because that's what they were fighting. The church, because in the centuries prior to the Church of England flip-flop back and forth, that, what they say Episcopalian or Anglicans don't know what they believe. They're fence sitters, and it's a big joke. Sorry to any Episcopalians in the room, but because they can't figure out whether they want to be Roman Catholic or Protestant. And when you have that constant state being driven by a perceived spiritual or religious expression, then you're constant. And so the idea is let's not have those two. But so here, I'm going to read you a story, and this is from The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters. And it's an interesting book. It does shape, it was a good reminder of that we meet so many ways and do so many things that mean nothing. We just do it because it's ritual, but there could be more meaning in life if we recovered those rituals. But she's talking about an example, and she's Indian. Yeah, around the challenges of a marriage, what marriage traditions from times past to times present. So let me read you this excerpt. Today in India, for example, one such clash is arising over the structure and content of marriage rites within the gathering of a traditional Hindu wedding. In the traditional format, the rites end with a man and woman taking 7 steps around a fire, each step saying a vow to each other. These fairas or rounds are visually striking, and for many Hindu families, steeped in meaning and tradition. It is often the photograph plastered on the living room wall that the children grow up staring at and imagining for their own weddings one day. But some younger couples are beginning to feel that the actual spoken words of the vows depict an outdated view of marriage. The man directs his wife in the first vow to offer him food. The bride agrees to be responsible for the home and all the household responsibilities. Only the bride vows to remain chaste, with no such requirement made of the man. 4 of the groom's 7 vows relate to children, but all of the bride's vows relate to the groom, and so on. The underlying assumption of the vows describe an ideal of marriage that many no longer want. But when they suggest changing the ritual to better reflect their actual values, the parents are shocked and often deeply hurt, seeing it as a rejection of their traditions. And the form itself has come to carry the power because of the repetition through generations, even when it no longer serves as the ostensible purpose of the wedding for this couple. Does that make sense? So this is another way, and this just, as I was rereading this, it sort of struck me, that's sort of that example that remained in the back of my head. I think that and this is in some sense not, and a little bit of the reverse, saying that they should revisit those and reinvent. And this actually is more in line with almost that Nietzschean things based on my own, as opposed to what he is suggesting, which is we dig back into the first 3 and look truer. But that is but the ritual is a fragment of what it was because it doesn't embody the original intent. and therefore it's misinterpreted and misused, and therefore not valued and devalued by the culture that it's in. Does that help? Not help? Good. Yeah.
You're saying that sometimes the old is not good, it needs to be changed.
Absolutely.
So when I heard that the people are saying this is an antiquated system and it should not be remained. So what's wrong with changing?
That's it. This is an expression more of what it's the same example. It's the response that she has is not, and the recognition, really, if you wanted to put it in, there's a recovered, what she will argue is that there's a recovery of the essence of marriage understood through a current context that incorporates past traditions.
Okay.
So new monasticism is not a pure expression of first century Christianity. It's meant to look back and say, what defined first century Christianity? Well, there was a submission to Jesus Christ. There was an active engagement in hospitality. There was care for one another. And, the 12 marks of new monasticism would have been a reinterpretation of those expressions. But it's taking the essence of them, not one. Did you all used to do that before I arrived? I love the passing of the peace. I also hate how the passing of the peace is done. In many churches and in many services, you say, let's pass the peace, and people will shake hands and say, hey, how was last night? You look good. And I say, you lost weight, Ron? and it becomes a chit-chat time, whereas that act of you look at church when it was in, when that notion of passing up in a society where you are being persecuted by people and you risk imprisonment or death, when you gathered with other Christians, there was a deep sense of peace that was exchanged of you're together, you're live. And so when you take that sense of what the passing of the peace is, it is meant to be literally a physical and spiritual exchange and an embrace. It's not even really probably a handshake. So as I've led, and we'll get to the place when we can do passing peace again, and I'll encourage you all, look one another in the eyes. And when I look in your eyes and I say, peace of Christ be with you, and then you say, and also with you, and then we embrace one another, the idea behind that is the essence of Christ's peace is felt between us. But our expression of the passing of the peace is a fragment of what it was. So we have fragmented, we are living in the fragments of faith in a way that doesn't allow us to live holistically as Christians. And we have so allowed things to fill those fragments. And then what he goes on in this chapter and decided to say is that there's so many things that are idolatry. And they become idolatry for us, and they become the things. And so we end up then constructing things around what we think ought to be. And that's what, and we'll get to that. Let's just go through. I just want to kind of highlight a number of things. And again, if there's something that comes up, I'm just going to do big picture stuff on each page and kind of walk you through his argument. The first thing, I love that example of the idea that what if we lived in an apocalyptic time and all science was all of a sudden just destroyed. Actually, I had forgotten that, and I thought he was going to go to the place where I was thinking that's kind of like scriptures, like you're piecing together stuff that you have and you do the best. The difference is we would trust the Holy Spirit as led in that process. But if we got to the place where science no longer had this hold because we just had bits and pieces and fragments, then you're seeing what was once a whole system in a fragmented sense. And he's kind of trying to create an apocalyptic picture to explain what would happen if science in this age of science was fragmented in the future.
Kind of like now.
Kind of like now, it is.
Well, kind of like defund the police.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think part of it too is that we won't go down that path, thanks, but but no, I mean, but there are narratives there. We don't control the narratives. Media controls the narratives. I don't even think government controls the narrative. I think media controls more than anything. And media is funded in all sorts of heinous ways, I'm sure. So by the government and individuals. But all that's to say, well, let's go through this and walk through. I want to make sure we actually do this. And this is what he's arguing that there right now, on that first page, the first page you can just flip. That's just him talking about like what would have happened. When he talks about the fact that the last sentence of the first, like sort of, for everything that they do and say now contains a certain canon of consistency and coherence, that those contexts which would be needed to understand what they are doing have been lost. And what he's saying in that is that when it's so far back, you never really get to the place where you can reconstruct what was. And we, in many ways, find ourselves that there is no current understanding of morality, because that we all agree on what some authors will say is a sacred canopy. We all are walking around with our individual sacred umbrellas that say, I'm going to define my own spirituality based on my own feelings, not a larger system of people agreeing and deciding to do something together. And this is part of the diversification of culture. Yeah.
It's not necessarily.
There are pros and cons to all of this, and this is not an all or nothing, sort of situation. He says right there in that second half of that on page 14, he basically, anytime you see something start in this chapter, I will, he's describing exactly what he's going to do. And that should, you always want, I actually put a circle and a little cross through it, like, because it's like a compass, because that reminds me that that's where the orienter was. And if I'm ever lost in a chapter, I'm like, what the heck is this guy talking about? I will go back to that thesis statement, and that will help me reframe what's being said. So that's like, after the halfway point, it's the last sentence. In this chapter, I will describe this fragmentation and show how the church participates in it. So that's what we're going to look at, how the church is fragmented. I will also show how fragmentation in the church often mistakes our disordered language for well-ordered language, and only has some simulacrum of the Christian mission, or some shining example of it, or some shimmer of it. Unsatisfactory imitation, a veneer would, if you will. We often call the Christendom a veneer to true Christianity, not that Christianity is particle board underneath. And basically, he's in the rest of the page, he's saying our understanding of the Christian witness is fragmented. Our thinking about what it means to proclaim the gospel is missing, is a fragment of what it was. And my mother came to faith through Billy Graham. And it was a conversion moment, and felt the Holy Spirit, and I fully affirm Billy Graham for so much of what he did. But at the same time, Billy Graham had a 6% retention rate. So despite those soaring numbers that we like to dwell in, the actual numbers are much more bleak. Not to say that what he did was wrong, but what he did was a expression of the culture it was in. But sometimes when the expression of the gospel is too shaped by the culture it comes in, it doesn't come out as a faithful expression as it might. That appeals to the masses, yeah.
I don't know what his message was.
Well, just to four spiritual gospels, salvation, prayer, and you're good to go. It was simplistic, and it was focused on what Wilson would say would be idolatry of having numbers saved. The goal became, well, like I said on Sunday, the goal, there is no cap. And so when it becomes our job to save people, then we're always counting. This is the problem with church membership. When the PNC interviewed me, they're like, will you grow a church? Maybe young people will come because you're young. And I'm like, I don't really care if young people come, or if I grow the church, I care that we are the church, because I know that when we are the church, that we will grow. But that's a side product, not a
primary goal.
Yeah. Well, when he goes on to say that the one is an internal goal versus an external goal, or an internal good versus an external. An external good of a church being healthy is that it will grow. But if you focus on the external good, then you're always doing whatever you do in the church just so that it will grow. Like I said, I went to London and started it from nothing and had a youth group of 150 and less than 6 months. Well, it doesn't take much when you rent a gymnasium, have a bunch of bouncy castles, and order a bunch of pizza or food. You get kids there, and then you can preach to them. But are those kids in the church now? Probably not. so maybe what I should have done way back in the day when I went to the UK was I should have started maybe a discipleship program and really took the kids that I had and really formed them in the faith, in the hopes that that actual personal transformation that would happen would spread and grow. You know, discipleship is a multiplication factor, not a massive addition factor. And although we do have these examples of the first proclamation of the gospel being to larger crowds, that does not necessarily mean that we necessarily have to live in that way. You know, in an era of Christendom, we don't have to proclaim that in large crowds in the same way, and we don't. I mean, we do on TV, I guess. Some traditions do on television. So, Pat, any questions, thoughts? You can interrupt me.
My thought was that Billy Graham's, his ministry was a revival ministry. And he got people excited in large numbers, so that they fed off of the Spirit in that one place. But the next week, Billy was gone to another town, so there was no
Follow-up.
Yeah, no follow-up. I don't know that he ever preached a regular, shepherded a regular church.
He was an evangelist.
He was an evangelist.
Not a, you know.
But that's the revivalist notion, and then the rest of it's up to you.
And and that is a notion that might have been, and it probably came out of the first and second Great Awakening, his idealism around that. But and I think he was loosely Presbyterian or was Presbyterian. But the idea that you proclaim that in that way was something at the time was ripe, and it was also at a time where everyone thought the world was going to pot, because it was in the '60s and it was like massive shifts, and this was, you know, again, this is your generation, so we're living in what you all have created. Ooh, burn.
Not me.
I'm just kidding. As an Xer, as a generation who's literally forgotten, I like it. I'm like the middle child of the, it's funny though, they did there's a neat, you can see it on YouTube, but there's a news broadcast where they're like talking about the different generations. And they're like, in the last 4 generations, and they pull up a chart, one of those little infographics, and it said silent generation years, boomer generation years, millennial generation years, and Generation Z. So they didn't even include the Gen Xers in that list. They left the gap. So like the years were still sort of squirreled away, but they just completely cut off. I don't know, so that's the story of being Gen X.
Was that also
the Gen Xers? Or the boomers were the hippie generation. Early boomers are more institutionalists, and they're the ones who probably were more responsible for banking and things like that. The later ones were more the hippie crowd who were responsible for the revolutions. So, but it coincides with the development of psychological research. And that's the thing, I don't blame boomers. You grew up in an era that said who you are as a person mattered the most. Your personal expression mattered the most. Well, that notion, that therapeutic notion that he addresses in here, goes directly against the note of what the gospel is. That says when you actually come to faith, you lose to some extent, you sacrifice your personal identity for the sake of the communal identity found in the body of Christ. You don't lose yourself as a person, but there's a deprioritization of oneself. And again, that goes back to the fact that if we really believe this is a temporal space, you got 10 years, 20 years left in life. Well, what does that mean? Yeah.
Well, you've mentioned mission gospel several times. Saying in the beginning, that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
How do you define it?
What do you mean?
What is the mission gospel?
Oh, what is the proclamation of the gospel?
What is that versus today?
What is it? Well, I think probably at its basis, it is the upside down kingdom that we're looking at in the Gospels right now in the Bible study. It's that sense of not the exaltation of we are being called to usher in a material wealth that exemplifies God's kingdom. And in fact, if you really, and I really have, this is not a judgment on our society because I'm a part of it just as much as we are, as everyone is, but the expression of what Christ truly calls us to in the gospel is not how we live at all. And it's a hard thing to say, and it's not fun as a pastor because I'm sure I'm going to make someone mad. What's that?
You mean literally.
Well, just the sense of Christ says, deny ourselves, take up our crosses, consider others better than ourselves, regard others, care for the poor, watch out for the widows and orphans. And like, there's so many of these things that Christ himself is recorded as saying. And if we truly believe these are words from God, do our communal expressions of who we are as Christians reflect that in a fragmented way? In a fragmented way, yes. Yeah.
I'm uneasy with references to the good old days, because I don't really think the good old days were good in many ways. And I'm not even sure the early days of the church were necessarily all good. I mean, the epistles talk about problems in a lot of the early
No,
churches,
absolutely.
because we're all sinful human beings. And there is progress as culture develops. I'm very happy to live in this world rather than the 19th
Me too.
century. Or even in the 50s. A lot of things have improved. Other things have declined. It's always, a struggle.
Yeah.
But to assume that those early church days were so superior to there are so many good small pockets of Christianity today that are doing wonderful things.
Well, pockets, I think, is the key word in what you just said.
Yeah, exactly.
But we live in a society that says we expect Christianity to be the norm, where it's a monolithic religion that covers our nation. And that's sort of like, well, it's a Christian nation. Why shouldn't it be? We established it as such, and this is, and there's nothing in Christ's gospel that points to the, nationalization of a religion or an expression of faith.
I have to ask, keeps occurring to me as I read through all the differences there are in interpretation that different ways that the different churches practice their rituals and do all the things that they do. Can you not live faithfully without going to church?
Yes, absolutely. Just
Exactly.
yes. Despite what was said on 4th of July. Yes, I think you can, absolutely. But I do think, and just to keeping in vein of monasticism, when one of the things that kept Benedict from being a isolated monastic person, he was the question, whose feet do I wash? And when you look back to Christ's last impartation, his last moments of before his death with his disciples, there was a sense of we are called to be in community with one another. And then that leads us then to doctrines of the Trinity and relationality that says when God put his image, or put their, it's actually plural, put their image in us, that image contained a relationality because the Trinity has a relational dynamic to it.
That's what I wanted to say. I no longer, if someone says you're real religious, I say, I am not religious at all. I hate religion. Religion means bondage. It comes from the word bondage. And I am in a relationship with Jesus Christ. I am not into religion.
Yeah.
And so when religion comes up,
In a sense, that's what he's talking about.
But yeah, relationship.
But he's
The
saying
word
that
I've been looking for, yeah.
our religious expressions are fragments of what was. And where I would tack onto that relationship, yes, you were in a relationship with God, and that was given to us by the Holy Spirit. We relate to God as individuals. But when we come into a relationship with Christ, we are welcomed into a body. And our relationship is not me and God, it's me and you and me and God. For us and God even more so. That's why what Christ said, our Father who art in heaven, give us our daily bread. There was a communal understanding of what we are, which is what the heart of this book is, that idea of creating a community of practice. That's what his conclusion is. Benedict was a community of Christian practices. They said these are critical to who we are and our expression of how we understand the gospel. We're going to live it out together. in a very intentional way. And that's what we're not creating a monastic community here. What we're doing is recognizing that there are things from the history of the church that Wilson is pointing to that will serve us in this setting here well. May not, if I was in a church in Seattle, in downtown Seattle, maybe I would be having this conversation in a different way. But if, you know, when I didn't come here 10 years ago, I went to a church of 4,200 members. I wasn't about to say, hey, we should be a small community of practice. And we already are a small community of practice isolated in the mountains. What I am leading toward, quite frankly, is that we are a small community in the mountains that are embracing intentional Christian practices that define who we are as a body of Christ.
But the answer to the question,
Is
can you live faith?
Can you live?
absolutely,
faithfully
yeah.
Without joining with a body?
Depends on how you define faith. I mean, is it, you know, it's on a spectrum. Is it an issue of salvation? No. I would never say that someone in an isolated out spirituality by themselves on a faithful expression. I just don't like people. I don't want to be around people. I think everyone is a bunch of jerks, and I just want to be by myself. Well, that reflects lack of transformation.
That could have been,
But there could also be trauma in their past.
Right.
There's also the disabled who don't have the capacity to. So that's why I'm saying there's always a caveat. I think God's much bigger than that. The short of it is that we were created to be in community.
But I think it's certain with your relationship with God, when he said, I came as a servant. And I think being that, I don't think the church is necessarily the serving us would be the point.
Well, yes.
You planning a withdrawal?
Spend your whole life serving others, not necessarily with other people in the church.
Right.
Yeah, I think you could live out a saved life. I don't want to. I'm not here to judge, so I don't want to judge someone's faithfulness. I don't think. I think that choosing to be against the body would be a problem. But even then, I wouldn't judge their spirituality.
It's one thing to be against the body, but it's a whole different thing just not to want to be part of it.
Well, and honestly, these days, you know, working for the denomination I went in churches all over the denomination, and most of the time I was like, this is horrible. Like I hated going to church because it made me. Now sometimes it was encouraging, but most of the times it was sad.
You were going to the wrong churches.
I went to a lot of, you know, trust me, if I was going to church, it wasn't a small country church. It was, and maybe that's where I should have been going to see. But yeah, I think those are struggling too. But the church as a whole is struggling in our society. We're all wrestling with the fact that we were the big dog in the yard a little while ago. So the good old days we often refer to is when you could walk out and you know, in public and be like, and wear a Jesus shirt, no one would think it was weird.
Right.
Well, it should be weird. We're not. What's that?
Those churches at that time had problems too.
Yeah, they did,
Under the
absolutely.
surface, we just didn't acknowledge them.
Yeah.
They were exclusive of certain people.
Oh yeah.
Only the ones who fit the.
Well, but that happens on both sides. It happens all over the place. And unfortunately, the farther out you get on the spectrum, the more their ideology looks like very similar, with just different issues. But their sense of engagement is different. It's kind of a line drawn in the sand. Let's hold some thoughts. I want to get through some of this.
Sorry.
You know, this is all fantastic conversation, and conversation we need to be having. And I don't think we're like, just to be clear, I don't think we're like way off track or anything. I just think this is good stuff to think about. So he talks about on page 15 what fragmentation is. You know, he says basically we have remnants of the mission of God, remnants of the gospel. I do think it says, you know, like to do this, it says right in the middle, to do this, it'll require hard work and persistent work by communities rooted in a provisional understanding of this fragmentation. So in other words, if this is something that we value and we think there's some truth to what he's saying, then it means that we're going to go through a season and try to figure, and I don't think it's a rough season, but I think it's a season of saying what matters. In other words, what matters in our worship? And if we confine our lives together as just happening in a 2-hour period on Sunday, which I don't think we do, then we are saying then that is the fullest expression of, Sunday cannot just be the only expression of our faith life together and our communal life together. And I think we have lots of places of intersection. I think we're set up perfectly for that. And I think what he goes on down this page and basically saying is that we all sense there is something that's not right in culture. We all know that everyone has their own opinion and everyone's truth is their own truth. And again, this is what we're seeing right now is what he will point to and call that Nietzschean ethic that we'll talk about, I think, in the next time. The last paragraph, I want to read that. He says basically, he goes into the starting of the argument, we live in a fragmented world, not in a pluralistic world. And I'm going to kind of go through this. He says, if we live in a fragmented world, then we do not have relatively enact communities of disciples in the church. Instead, we have fragments of discipleship and fragments of community. And basically, that's what we were talking about earlier, that the things that we have are pieced together, they're piecemealed in particular. And I think he probably is offering a little bit of he's offering an institutional critique of mainline churches, meaning Roman Catholic and all of the Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian. But he also is offering a critique of evangelical churches and some of these things that happen. And in both of these and all of these, we are fragments from the past and they're reinterpreted fragments, basically saying that all of this stuff was before. And that we're not in a pluralistic society. And what he means by pluralism is, he defines it somewhere, by pluralism, I'm using it here to describe a world of, page 16, last paragraph, a world of competing outlooks, traditions, or claims to truth. And it pictures a cultural map made up of coherent, integrated traditions or positions that can be clearly differentiated from one another. And the short of it is this: we don't live in that world. When I did collegiate ministry many years ago, I was the national director for the campus ministries in the United States for the PCUSA, and I would fly and visit these. And I would always be part of it. There was lots of interfaith dialogue going on our university campus. They get Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Christians together, and hands down, it is always the Christians who don't know what they believe. Now we're starting to see a change, and this younger generation of other religions are coming up, are experiencing the same process. But if a Christian were to engage in that conversation and know what they believe, not representing that fragmentation, then everyone exists in this space on equal terms. And it's the idea of, hey, you're Buddhist, I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to engage with you. I don't have to adopt your worldview, but I can respect that the culture that you grew up within gave you this worldview. The first time I took a course on Buddhism in seminary, and it said that when Buddha was born, he was birthed out of his mother, he stood up, took 7 steps, and declared himself enlightened. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. But you know what else is ridiculous? The idea that God implanted a virgin girl with a baby, and that baby came and had God, it was God. That's also kind of sounds ridiculous. So pluralism says we all have ridiculous ideas, and we're going to all respect those ideas, and we're all going to coexist in a way. Pluralism really would be if you were, just an absolute universal pluralist. It would also, then you would say that every path leads to God. Now we as Christians don't confess that. Buddhists might confess that. I don't deny that God can use all religions to reconcile the world to himself or herself or itself or themselves or whatever you want to call God, because we're all taking stabs at this. But in Christianity, as a organized expression of faith, we have words that say Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, we as a religious tradition have a exclusionary claim that we make. Not all, so do the Muslims, so do the Jews.
Well, I guess the other thing to consider is that it's hard to, the concept that everyone that is not a Christian was not created by God.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got that.
Or created for death.
So, or I also, I kind of do, maybe I am a little pluralistic, but I always kind of had that concept that that they did, that they, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, but
I mean, because maybe that's just the naivete.
well, no, it's honestly, it's not. And I think it's actually, I mean, I would say I have a similar position, but I would say it's nuanced. So, you know what? There are lots of things I'm agnostic. If you really want, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if we resurrect the body. I mean, you know, this is a faith decision. So there's a certain reality within our minds that says, I am making a decision to believe that which I have no proof of, and that's where faith steps in. But that doesn't obliterate that part of your brain that's like, God, are you real? Or is this all true? And that sense of doubt or uncertainty is part of what makes faith, because we're not certain. And it's okay to have it. So I say, is where I'm agnostic in belief. Are Muslims going to be saved in the end? I don't know. I'm agnostic in that. I'm Orthodox in confession. I choose the positive perspective of my faith is found in Christ Jesus.
What's that one thing in that? God, thank you for my belief, forgive my unbelief.
Yeah. And that unbelief will always remain with us. So. Okay, so pluralism is, what he's saying is the diversity of views we see right now is not pluralism. That's what he's really trying to get at. What we're seeing in culture is not true pluralism. Pluralism is a much more, not that you can't have that exist, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing fragmentation, and they're fragments of morality. They're fragments of our understanding of everything. But, you know, spirituality and relationality and how we relate to one another, these are all fragments of things that have come from our past. And we don't know how to piece them together. And the challenge of all of this is human identity theorists that say, you know, you understand yourself as somebody and you have an identity. Well, that is not constructed in isolation as an individual. It's always constructed in relationship to a community. It's often formed most by those who have emotional ties with your parents, your brothers and sisters, your grandparents, your faith community. And that's how you learn what the world is through this process. But the idea that I lost my train of thought. Oh, identity, that when you have so many fragmented pieces you're pulling together, that it's really hard to develop a cohesive identity. So the fact that young people in their 30s are saying, I don't know who I am. I need some time to figure, you're 30 for crying out loud, get a job and figure out your, but you know, and before, a couple centuries ago, when you were 15, you knew who you were because you were raised in a cohesive community. You were starting to rear children at a very young age. You got your parental views of how you parent from not only your parents, but from the cohesiveness of the community that surrounds you. But we live in a day and age, and as someone who is a Christian educator and has taught for over the years, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard parents say, I just want my kids to be able to choose for themselves.
Yeah.
I'm just going to raise and this is how we got sort of the Mickey Mouse here of fun youth ministry, is we just want our young people to be happy in the church. And somehow if they feel happy and have good feelings about the church, that's going to translate to lifelong discipleship. Well, now we know that did not work. And what we're recognizing is that if we raise our children in communities of practice where everyone around them understands a set of beliefs that we choose, it doesn't have to mean we have to agree on everything, but it means the things that we gather for are central to who we are in identity. That means that, you know, and this is the problem. This is part of the reason I'm here, is because I was traveling all over the country teaching this stuff. And I realized that my son, Silas, was in, you know, different churches. We hopped around, sometimes not in church, like had no consistent community beyond our family surrounding him that said, this is who we are. But so that's part of the, like I said, I'm going to write what I believe and I'm going to practice what I preach. So I want Silas to be in a community where he is raised around a group of people who said, these are who we are, so that when he goes off on, he says, that is who we in the Amish community.
I was just gonna say that.
And I don't really agree. That's a little bit of an abusive system for a number of reasons. I think there are healthy ways to express that. But, and Rumspring is a great idea. But the same, but is the concept in LDS. LDS is the fastest growing religious organization in the country. Why? Because they establish themselves as having beliefs.
Yes.
And people who are within that system said, we will gather together and be a community of
Take care of
intentional
each other and also prepare and just be smart.
So the National Study of Youth and Religion, which has been a 20-some-year now project of studying a group of people from high school age back in 2000, and now they're studying them every 5 years. They're taking measures about where their spirituality is. And long story short, back in 2000, they did a big study to see how parents were passing down faith to the children. And to put it on a perspective, the Roman Catholics were doing the worst. Sorry, Jim. And then the mainline Protestants were next. And then it went American Baptist and sort of like, and then to evangelical traditions, to racial ethnic communities, to Pentecostal communities. And then the best organized religion for passing down faith was the Mormons.
What were they saying the Catholics were doing?
That there was a disconnect between, well, largely over here, what the faith they say was called moral therapeutic deism, which means that young people view religion to tell them or to say what is right and wrong, whether or not they ascribe to it makes no big difference. That church is there or religion is there to help us feel better about life, and feel happy, as he mentions in here. And then also that God was real, but God was distant. So that deism, that God's way over there. So I can make moral decisions on this earth don't matter to God because it's not really affecting anyone but myself. So that was the dominant religion of teenagers in the early 2000s. And they're tracking that every 5 years. They release that study and they revisit those 4,000 people to see where their faith is and how it's doing.
I
Yeah.
don't want this to be off or anything, but do you have an opinion on how COVID has affected the community?
Yes,
Yes.
that is off.
That's off, okay.
We'll call, you can ask me that question after.
Later, okay.
So yeah, go on.
I just one comment to throw out, and that's, I was mostly in Silas's place in life in the 50s probably. And what I noticed was, to me, it was the Catholics who knew who they were.
Mhm.
When I saw my best friends were all Catholics, was that they did things a certain way, and they did it intentionally, and they didn't deviate from the path.
Yeah.
And to me, at that age, that was very attractive.
Mhm.
Very attractive. And all of the Protestant denominations were all kind of, oh, well, they do this and they do that. And they separated themselves because they were kind of exclusionary. It's like, well, I don't like the Baptists because they shout, or I don't like the, and yet those were all Christians.
Yeah.
But they had separated themselves. But the Catholics hung together, and I wanted that as a child.
And unsurprisingly, Alistair McIntyre, who wrote what he's writing about, joined the Catholic Church after this. This was part of his journey.
Wow.
Yeah. Because it was the last place in history that he saw communal expression. Not that it was perfect, but it goes back to that period of right before the Reformation, where things began to start to fragment even more.
Wow.
Times change.
They do.
Yeah.
So let's, he says at the top of 17, the disagreements we have the disagreements we have are difficult to resolve as we cannot locate them in some coherent position or community. And this is what he's saying. Like, we often know what we're against. We're like, yeah, I don't like that, but we really don't know what we're for. And honestly, really, in my examination of and work with Christian teenagers, and I'm going to say this, and then we're not going to go down this as a rabbit trail, but I think it's a perfect example of it is young people these days have a much broader view of sexuality, not necessarily because and their understanding of the relationship between God and sexuality is mediated by the fact that they don't want to be intolerant of others rather than a rationale for what they believe. In other words, most people will affirm homosexuality of a younger age, not necessarily because they understand why, but because they want to not be intolerant. So they're choosing a virtue that says, I don't want to be that, so I'm going to choose this. And this happens all over the place, not just in big topics like that. We say, I don't want to be that in that political party, or not, look at you. Or just as your next. We do that about everything. Other cultures, you know, in other words, like we look at and we're like, I don't like that. I want to be like the bath alcohol every weekend in communion, maybe. I don't want to do that because what does that say about me? Well, we don't have a rationale for why we're choosing grape juice over, you know, we're just saying that doesn't feel right to me. And this, we come to a place where, because we can't locate our moral decisions in a cohesive community, the only way we can define them is by what we have aversion towards. I grew up in the 17, you know, in a very isolated Assemblies of God environment where I was told the Nazarenes were, I couldn't hang out with the Nazarenes because they were, I know so, okay, let's go to page 18. I don't want to run over, I think we may go a few minutes over time. 18, we have 10 minutes. Let me pause for a second and let me just think about how I want to do this, because I want to. I'm going to summarize chunks rather than going to. There are some sections I want to read. On 18, basically, he's saying a pluralistic world is defined by clear boundaries, and we don't have those boundaries. That our increased diversity in our culture is not pluralism, but fragmentation. And as I said earlier, those other immigrant cultures that are coming, in Chinese American or in Asian American cultures, where much of the immigrants that come over only speak Chinese or only speak Taiwanese or whatever it might be, and their children integrate fastly. And they as an Asian, I can say this, it's called Asian white. It's a term that means Asians integrate into white culture much more rapidly than other cultures and other ethnicities do. And so the younger generation integrates in much faster. And then now all of a sudden there's this massive cultural divide between first generation and second generation Asian living here. And we see this in faith life across the board. Presbyterian Church is dealing with it all the time in terms of the Korean population, because it's one of the largest ethnic groups in our denomination. And there's a fragment, that fragmentation that comes from a Korean's identity of who I was in relationship to my parents and who I am in the culture that I live in now and who I am as a Christian that goes back centuries. Those are all things that they have to factor in and deal with. And that is challenging.
Wait a minute, what did you say? That diversity leads to fragmentation?
No, diversity is an expression of that fragmentation.
So we shouldn't have diversity?
No, not at all. That is equating one negative thing with another, because just because fragmentation is negative and diversity is a part of fragmentation doesn't make this necessarily an evil. In other words, just because something is a cause of something else doesn't mean that the diversity that happens is a problem. And in fact, I would argue that the diversity was part of God's intention. Tower of Babel, when people gathered in, right. He said, go out, get out of here, and so we see several places where diversity was instituted by God for the very purposes. That doesn't mean that the fragmentation or the way we have constructed our lives are represented from a holistic way of approaching. The goal that we're here is to say, hey, we're all sort of living fragmented lives. We all have different beliefs, and we're not going to change all of our beliefs. But we as a community of faith are going to say, what is it that we believe? How do we want to express that? How does that how do those expressions of that consider the history of the church, making sure that we are paying attention to that history? And then what we give rise to is a group of people who are saying, these are things that we've intentionally chosen to do because they express who we are in Christ. The last sentence of that, I just want to point out that it's funny that it says Free Will Baptists would want to say that you can still tell them from Presbyterians if you read that. They were talking about the differences, and in contrast, Free Will, talking about the differences of Baptists and the fragment, and that really is. And I have a picture here. You can't see it very well, but it's like this sort of slooping up. This is the Orthodox Church here, and then the Roman Catholic Church here, and then the Protestant Reformation happened here, and you see more fragmentation. And we get to the place where it splinters so many times that every single Protestant denomination is a fragment of something that traces its way back to the gospel. But sometimes by allowing the cultural conditions at the time to deem what that fragmentation is. because we're products of culture. We can't help that. But an awareness of that allows us to say, we're not called to be products of culture, but we're called to be first to define ourselves and who we are by Christ and the cross. All right. Oh, actually, I wrote at the bottom, CPC works because of accepted fragmentation. We're a multi-denominational church. We're not a Presbyterian church. I mean, we're a Presbyterian church because that's who we're, just because you have Presbyterian pastors and it's Presbyterian property. But beyond that, we're really sort of an ecumenical interdenominational church, and it works because we are all fragmented. We're all expressions of different forms of faith, but it works because somewhat not in a pluralistic sense, but we say those differences don't define us. One of the, again, many reasons why I think that what he's talking about here works in this environment. Like this is, I don't know if I wouldn't recommend this book for most places, but it seemed to work here. Top of page 19, it says the church in the West is fragmented because it has, its life has for so long been intertwined with the larger culture. As the culture has fragmented, so has the church. And it talks about those three things in that first paragraph. It says where humans are on the moral. He shows the moral schemes were previously coherent, depended on their coherence upon the conceptual scheme that gave it the description of. In other words, people bought into the idea of a universal morality because it identified or had a description of where the humans are on the moral landscape. You could identify that. Let's just go back to the 50s or 40s or something when you had more of a universal understanding of morality in our country. Where they should be, that sense of ought that defined our morality, and how to get from here to there. So where is it? It's located in a certain time and place, 50s. What ought? Well, you want to even go back maybe a few more decades. You ought to sit on your porch and talk to your neighbors. And in fact, architecture reflected that in the 1930s. You had big front porches. Well, when did that stop? Oh, around the 1950s, the 1960s, when people were like, you know what, we have different ways of manufacturing. Let's stick patio. Well, actually, before there was for 50s, you had patios in the back to start. Let's put a patio in the back. Let's shrink the front porch. You had smaller entryways. You could track this all through architecture, communal theology through architecture.
I remember my houses.
And then it was kind of like, well, we're done with the stone brick patios. We have access to the world of woods and other things. And so we started importing everything, and we put decks out. So then now we put privacy fences. And what we've done is what was once a communal ethic and an understanding of how architecture worked. I'm going to sit in and be a part of the community in the evening. I'm going to go have my thing in the back, and I'm going to have a garage behind. So I'll pull back there, we have our little private party. So even in our architecture, in a matter of 60, 70 years, we have isolated ourselves from one another.
But front porches also were a way of spying on your neighbors and gossiping about them.
Making sure they
You can find a negative in it, though. I mean, I think that,
grandmothers, the backyards weren't huge, but they were all separated by chain link fences that you could see through.
Yeah.
and then you can track the progression of fences as well.
But that doesn't happen anymore. Now you have solid wood
Solid
slabs.
fences, yeah.
That's why you get it ladders.
Well, because the chain link fences were meant to, from a distance, to give you the perception of continuous land.
And you were neighborly.
Yeah.
It didn't bother you to say hello to your neighbor when they came outside.
But as long as their dog didn't come into your yard.
Right. But chain link fences were good
For that reason. So what Wilson is arguing is that of those three things, well, where is always where it is. I mean, and where it originated from, but that sense of ought, of why we do things, is not there in our culture. This is that sense of that positive affirmation. And this is where the word teleology, Jimmy, you were asking about the word, the teleology just means the end or the aim. So what is the end or the aim? Now, prior to the Enlightenment, the end of all humankind was to glorify God. That was the understood teleology of the West. The goal of humanity was to delight in and glorify God. Well, we do not live in a culture right now that says that our personal existence on this earth and our communal existence on this earth is solely and primarily, not solely, primarily steered toward the glorification of God, it is actually more steered towards our delight in our lives and ourselves.
Happiness.
Yeah, the glorification of self. That's what it seems to be about.
And it, yeah, yes, and that just goes against everything the gospel calls us to. The glorification of self is precisely opposite of the way Christ lived his life.
Exactly.
So we are living in a fragment of what was. So he says basically the loss of teleology leads to the reinterpretation of the meaning of things, kind of like this example. Give me, can I have 10 minutes? Is that okay? I was trying to keep these to an hour, but I don't want to, I think I can. The idea that the church still influences culture and culture influences the church, both of those things are in an interplay, but they have to be kept in balance. And that's ultimately what he's arguing on page 20. The fragments of Western Christianity still exist all throughout culture. The fact that there are still debate, and Western spirituality. For example, the argument that the Ten Commandments should be in public high schools. Now, we're not going to debate that here, but that is a fragment of something that was an expression of who the nation was at one time. So whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing is debatable. I think there are good things about it, when the society wasn't more of a Christian society. But again, is that purely the example? Did that, when that came into being, was that culture itself expressing the gospel in an ideal way, or was it, sort of responding to the culture itself? Again, going back to the Billy Graham. We talked about patchwork self. The idea behind that really is of the identity. We try to piece ourselves together, and this is what young people are doing, piecing. You never feel whole. And this is why young people are trapped in a never-ending search for identity. And they've been conditioned that way because when they were young and they had a MySpace page, when they were, or then a Facebook page, or then, all the different incarnations, you can change your persona. My face or Facebook or MySpace originally was like, you could design whatever you wanted it to be. And one day you could be, and so teenagers will be goth one day and preppy one day and sporty next day, and no one has a problem with that. The fluidity amongst sexuality today is another expression of that, the sense of you can be whoever you want to be. We live in a society that says you can define who you are. And then they're constantly defining because they're never an expression of the community that they came from. So the idea that we said, we just want our kids to choose for themselves, what happens is they didn't choose anything. And that's why we end up. So he goes back on 20 and 21, and he really moves into worship. He says the inconsistency in worship and in life. I said how that inconsistency between worship and life is there. That idea that for 2 hours on a Sunday morning we'll be Christians, but we fragment and partition our spirituality into it. And I think that's not as true here. I don't think that's as true here, just to be clear. I think in larger society, that is very true.
It still happens.
I think it happens here too, probably. But I think in larger society, we see it. I think we live in a small enough town that we run into people and we have more of an integrated life anyways, which is why I feel like we're already on the right path, but to some of these concepts. He talks about in 21, and if I'm putting stars on both sides of this. It says like the ancient Israelites, the people of God in the Western Church have forgotten the purpose of worship is to teach us to glorify God and to enjoy God forever with our whole lives. Stepping down a little bit, a sentence or two. As a result of this disordering, we try to make worship serve other purposes. So, for example, we accept another version of the human telos or human goal, that we are to be happy and well-adjusted people. Again, moral therapeutic deism, the idea teenagers see faith as being just to make us feel good. Then we expect worship to be a kind of mass therapy session that makes us feel better. Or if we believe that the human telos or aim or goal is to be successful professionally, then we expect worship to be a kind of mass pep rally that energizes us for the world in the week ahead. We can even distort the purpose of worship by believing that the human telos goal is to be happy and healthy family. And so we expect worship to be ordered to that end. VBS, children's church, all of these things contribute to that idea. The happy, you know, when churches are like, oh, we just need to focus on the families, we get the families in, then we're okay. Or we need to focus on, you know, or high successful churches praise the idea of professional success because they want to leave feeling like they proclaim, you know, if you're a faithful person in a high executive power business type society, then you're doing really well and you're proclaiming the gospel in that way. So we take what we want out of our culture and we fashion the gospel and the mission around it, is what basically he's arguing.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't want to finish this, but I question that whole issue of the purpose of worship is only to glorify God and enjoy Him. That's the praise part. There are other parts to worship: confession, assurance of pardon, petition. I mean, there are other things that go into worship besides praise. And these praise and worship churches, that's the feel good part.
Well, don't define just praise and worship by music. He would be defining praise by all of the liturgy.
Right. And I get that, but that's the praise and worship style of worship that's popular today. But I think that traditionally there's many other elements to worship.
But I think what I'm saying is that your understanding of his word praise is he is not referring to modern day praise type environments. He's referring to the whole liturgical expression of offering oneself to God through the, you know, again, he went Catholic after it. So he probably, you know, he's looking at the deep liturgy of the church, not like, you know, he's more inclined towards that than towards happy clappy, so to say.
Well, but what I always appreciate about Presbyterian reform is that there's always confession and assurance of pardon.
That's because we believe we're all sinners. We have a strong view of human depravity.
And
Yeah, they do
well,
too.
if the purpose of worship is just to glorify God, then that's not accepting that.
I don't think he's saying there can't be any other aspect of worship that fails to honor the ultimate, you know, objective. I think what he's saying is there was a time in our culture throughout the last 2,000 years where the purpose or the goal of gathering together was purely for the glorification of this being of God, and that now there are lots of other agendas that come into it, in a way that, you know, yes, there's all sorts of interactions that we have with God in formation, transformation, and heaven, but that's not all. That's supposed to happen also outside of the service as well, and that's why he's talking about the community of expression, not just a Sunday morning one. 22, the top, and as much as I love all of 22, can you tell?
Yeah.
The understanding, like the first part of it, which part do I want to read? I wrote, God wants us to delight in Him, not in seeking our earthly happiness, and that we're called into community as individuals. We're called into be relationship with one another. The top part of this really is just an extension of that. You can see it, the word feel better. He says, of course, worship should make us feel better, but this goes back to the idea we should grow as a community of faith. But the goal is not that we grow, or the goal is not that we go to church to feel better. The goal is we go to church to worship God. And the result of it, and this is a confusion, this is why at the bottom of the page, he gets into this difference between internal goods and external goods. An internal good is something that happens within itself. So I often use this, for example, we played games last night. Well, why do you play games? One of the things I love about playing games is that it is an activity that is internally valuable. In other words, we played, you know, from 7 till 10:30 last night. I played board games with a group here, and then we went off and played a long board game. But when we did that, there's no gain at the end of the night other than the delight in the moment. The internal value of the game is that we played really well, and it went on long because we were all helping each other have the best strategy. So we delighted in the moment of experiencing this game, as opposed to saying, I'm only playing this game because I want to win. or because there's money on the line, or because there's some other, because I have an issue with, with losing, and I just have, and that's what makes poor sports. If your only goal is winning, then you've lost the whole point of playing the game. What he's saying is that if we truly worship and have if we truly are engaging in worship as a community, the value of the worship is the worship itself, not the result that I leave with. And that's too much what we give people today. We sell church to families because we want to give them programs so they feel like their kids are being met. We sell good worship. We sell good preaching. And we're caught in this world. You know what? If you can preach, you'll have a pastor that you'll draw people to it because they want to listen to the person. If you can't preach, you have a tough way in ministry because no one wants to come listen to you. So then we judge the entire service on the assent or the stimulation we receive from the sermon. Then we've taken an outside external focus of saying, I just want to have a good sermon. So let's go to the place that has the best, the shortest, most entertaining sermon, which is why I don't use very many examples, because I don't want to be too entertaining. So he goes on, he talks about, well, and then just to the fragment, he talked about basketball at the top. And this goes into something, a larger aspect of McIntyre's argument. He basically says practices are defined as things that have internal goods. So worship can be a practice because there are internal goods that can be gained by doing it well. Someone plays basketball, if they're not playing basketball for the money or the fame or different things, then they're not actually loving. They may be really good at the game, but they're just doing it because they want all of this. Whereas someone who plays basketball because they love it, they just can't get enough of it. They're playing basketball for the sake of the game itself. And the people who do that are the people who raise the value or the virtue within that environment. Internal payoff. And that's what, and he's trying to say we as the church need to be focused on the internal cohesion to the gospel. He talks about in the middle of it about the fragmentation that happened. And he says what goods are external to worship? Money, bodies, and likes. Dollar sign, people, and a little thumb up. And he calls those idolatry. So, so many of our churches today embrace idolatry because they're only focused on those external things. He talks about how there's these, my example was hiking. If you're only going to hike it just to accomplish it, then someone who I remember a guy who ran through the AT in 44 days.
Oh, gee.
Destroying it because his only goal was to finish it as fast as he could. And so think about all of the scenic views, all of the people, all of the experiences. Like he didn't hike. He just did a physical challenge. And yet we applaud that because we applaud these external things rather than say no. What happens to the transformation of the individual on that journey is what the journey is about. I like what he says, and I'm not going to do it about just the cross and how it's a leftover symbol and it's a fragment of it. That's the perfect example of fragmentation. That, and you don't have to be anything related to faith to wear a cross these days. And there are all sorts of things that are going on that people just wear because it's a symbol of American whatever. 2 more pages. Lastly, he ends up and he basically says Christendom's influence and culture is over. And that I'll read you he says this fragment at the top, 24, first paragraph down. He's talking about the cross. He says the fragmented symbol is a powerful warning to the difficulties faced by the church in its attempting to live faithfully, and that is that this cross is just pervasive. So everyone's a Christian. Oh, you're a Christian. If you're white in America, you probably assume the person's a Christian. It's just an assumption. But that means that anyone can be a Christian, and the value of being a Christian, the saltiness of being Christian, has been lost in our culture. And this is what happened when all of Rome was Christianized. There was no saltiness. And this is why Alistair McGrath and Jonathan Wilson, and I would agree with it, and many other theologians would say, we are living in an age that is paralleling the fall of Rome in the Dark Ages, and we're about to enter. We're not going to happen in our lifetimes, but the generations to come are about to experience a dark age like they've never seen.
I don't.
No, I do.
I do.
That's okay, you don't have to. We accept you and tolerate you.
I want a cookie.
And that's it. And basically, that's how he kind of ends. He basically says, and so the argument behind this is that we live in what you need to take from this chapter is we are living a fragmented version of Christianity. And the things that we value, I mean, honestly, if if the sheer professionalization of what I do is part of that fragmentation. I think if we truly were living out, not that we wouldn't have theological guides or leaders that rise up. In many ways, what Grace is doing is actually is more of an early church model where Andy Dozier is sort of coming up within. Now, the challenge we live in our day and age, though, to wrestle with this is that we're people, in particular in the Presbyterian or mainline traditions, we're thinking people. We want credentials. We want you don't go to a doctor because they're like, hey, I can fix that for you. And you're like, where's your credentials? No, you go to a doctor because they have been trained and studied. You're trusting that they're giving you a good advice. Well,
Kind of a little different.
well, it is the same thing, except for the fact that medicine and theology were looked at as handmaids prior to the 17th century. And faith and religious life and pastors were really looked at as an aspect of the healing of the whole person. And we're living in a fragmentation of that as well, where we've separated our spirituality from our expression of who we are. So the important thing to understand about this chapter is we need to base ourselves in history in chapter 1, and we need to understand that we are living in a fragmented culture, not a pluralistic culture, and a fragmented culture that is also that expresses a fragmented Christianity. Not only in just our traditions and how we're all broken up,
Right.
but even within our traditions, we're fragmented. And that's the chapter.
Thank you,
This next
Jason.
one gonna be any easier?
I'll end the recording on that one.